Late spring evenings along Blackwood Bayou usually offer a damp, stagnant calm. The water here does not flow. It simmers beneath a bruised, twilight sky, broken only by the occasional ripple of a gar, surfacing for a gulp of humid air. Two local anglers, reeling in trot lines near a grove of dying cypress trees, feel a massive, unyielding weight hook onto their line. Their small aluminum skiff tips dangerously as they haul the mass toward the reedy bank. It isn't a sunken log. A heavy-duty contractor bag bobs against the hull, swollen tight around jagged, unnatural contours. Black plastic scrapes violently against the metal boat. One of the men leans over the gunwale to free the snack, but a foul stench physically punches him in the throat. This odour goes far beyond rotting carb or marsh decay. Sweet, metallic rot clings to the soft tissue inside his nostrils, refusing to wash out. Blowflies have already found the prize, forming a frantic, buzzing cloud over a jagged tear near the base of the bundle. Murky fluid weeps steadily from the rupture, sliding down the synthetic material in dark ribbons. The younger angler gags, pressing a calloused, grease-stained hand over his mouth. Snatching a rusted gaffing hook, he digs the metal point in and drags the bulk into the shallows, his rubber boots sinking ankle-deep into the sucking sludge. Slicing the thick casing open releases a pressurized, sickening hiss. Trapped gases escape instantly, carrying a wave of putrefaction so concentrated it forces both men to stumble backward. What spills out onto the mud isn't organic yard waste or animal remains. An olive-drab army surplus hammock cocoons a distinctly human shape. Industrial-grade green nylon paracord wraps viciously around the exterior, binding the mass tight like a spider's prey. The tough fabric parts where a pocket knife just slashed through the center. Pale, bloated flesh breaches the sudden opening. Arthur Vance's face stares directly upward at the hanging Spanish moss. His jaw hangs entirely slack. A yawning cavity packed with bayou sediment, frozen permanently in a silent, desperate gasp. The whites of his eyes bulge from their sockets, clouded and completely vacant. Both arms are wrenched backward at a joint-popping angle. Wrists sit bound so tightly by the green cord that the nylon has vanished deep beneath swollen purple-black tissue. Dried blood from the ligatures forms crimson-brown flakes against his forearms. Deep abrasions ring his neck and broad shoulders, screaming of a frantic, violent struggle against the ropes before the end came. Down at the base of the twisted hammock, the true, cold mechanics of the burial lay exposed for the world to see. 2 heavy sacks of commercial quickread remained tethered securely to his rigid ankles. Someone wanted this man to stay at the bottom of the black water forever, hidden deep in the silt. However, the abrasive riverbed had slowly worn away the woven material of the right sack. Grey concrete powder spills freely into the damp earth, dissolving instantly into a cloudy, toxic slurry. That missing weight tipped the mathematical scale. Simple physics betrayed the killer, dragging the concealed nightmare slowly back up to the surface. The older fisherman stumbles backward in absolute revulsion, his heel catching a submerged, rotting root. Collapsing hard into the marsh, he scrambles away on palms and knees, while desperately pulling in breaths of clean air through his teeth. Acidic bile rises sharp in his throat, splashing down the front of his canvas waders. Fingers shaking uncontrollably, he fumbles for a mobile phone in his breast pocket, his thumb smearing swamp dirt across the glass as he dials for emergency dispatch. A human being secured, weighed down, and tossed into the absolute dark, whose swollen chest and sediment-packed throat indicate an agonizing fight for oxygen before the bayou swallowed him entirely. Why would an ordinary, blue-collar local be anchored to the mud like a piece of hazardous waste? Fluorescent bulbs hummed a steady, headache-inducing B-flat inside the coroner's suite. On the grooved stainless steel table, Arthur Vance's epidermis had sloughed off his fingertips like wet parchment a condition pathologists classify as maceration. Extracting a clean print from waterlogged tissue required injecting saline directly into the dead man's underlying dermis to artificially plump the decaying flesh. Just miles away, Evelyn Vance pushed through the heavy glass doors of the local precinct. She brought with her the overpowering scent of cheap floral perfume, a jarring contrast to the sterile chemical sting of formaldehyde currently coating the medical examiner's latex gloves. Clutching a crumpled tissue, Evelyn wrung her hands until the knuckles turned a bruised, bloodless white. Speaking to the desk sergeant, she claimed her husband had vanished 7 days ago. No note was left behind. 0 phone calls had been received. Arthur had simply walked out the front door and ceased to exist. Tears pooled in the corners of her eyes, yet she dabbed them away with practiced, surgical precision, ensuring her mascara remained flawless. Detectives watched the intake interview from behind mirrored glass. Something in her posture registered as entirely too rigid. Missing from her demeanour was the chaotic, collapsing despair of a partner whose anchor had just been ripped away. Her spine stayed perfectly straight. Inhaling and exhaling, she maintained a slow, metronomic rhythm. The automated database churned through the saline-plumped prints retrieved from the bayou. It spat out a biometric match before noon. DNA swabs confirmed the identity hours later. That bloated, concrete-anchored mass in the morgue cooler was legally, definitively Arthur. Investigators now possessed a grieving widow waiting in the lobby, seemingly unaware that her missing spouse currently drained into a floor grate. Protocol dictated a standard wellness check at the primary residence. Officers needed to establish a psychological baseline, map the victim's last known movements, and gently deliver the crushing notification. Detectives Miller and Hayes pulled their unmarked sedan into the Vance driveway. The suburban ranch home presented an utterly mundane facade. Fresh grass clippings clung to the baking asphalt. A rusted basketball hoop stood guard over the concrete path. Evelyn unlocked the front door, her voice trembling slightly as she invited the men inside. The living room smelled intensely of aerosol lemon polish. Every flat surface gleamed, stripped of dust, wiped clean of daily life. It felt less like a domestic sanctuary and more like a staged real estate viewing. Hayes casually asked to see Arthur's workshop, hoping to locate a calendar, a ledger, or perhaps a clue to his state of mind prior to disappearing. Evelyn hesitated. Muscle tension visibly popped the cartilage in her jaw. Guiding the investigators, she opened the side utility door. Trapped, musty heat assaulted the officers immediately upon crossing the threshold. Dark motor oil stains mapped the cracked cement floor. At first glance, it appeared as a typical blue-collar storage space. Pegboards held greasy, mismatched wrenches. Half-empty paint cans lined the sagging wooden shelves. But Miller's gaze locked onto the aluminum workbench, pushed against the far drywall. A heavy-duty plastic spool sat right beside a rusted vice grip. Coiled tightly around the cylinder was industrial-grade nylon paracord. It bore an unmistakable, vivid, olive-green hue. This was the exact synthetic thread currently sitting inside a sterile evidence locker, stained with dried plasma and embedded with Arthur's torn epithelial cells. Tucked beneath the workbench, wedged carelessly against a leaking jug of antifreeze, rested a cardboard box. Inside the open flaps sat a pristine, folded stack of heavy-duty black contractor bags. Hayes shifted his weight, his leather dress shoes scuffing the cement. The frantic, rhythmic buzzing of a trapped wasp failing to escape a dusty window pane dominated the heavy silence. These items were not weapons of opportunity grabbed in a blind panic. They represented calculated bulk supplies. The widow lingered near the doorway, her manicured nails picking aggressively at a loose thread on her cardigan. Unblinking, she watched the detectives examine the cord. The brutal tools used to bind, suffocate, and sink Arthur Vance hadn't been purchased by a faceless phantom in the night. They belonged right here, resting quietly next to the family lawnmower. Metal chair legs shrieked against the linoleum, a sound like grinding teeth that echoed off the cinder block walls of Interview Room B. Detective Miller tossed a sealed, translucent evidence bag onto the scratched aluminum table, offering no preamble. Inside the heavy plastic, a spool of olive green nylon cord sat secured with red tamper tape. Evelyn Vance stared down at the synthetic thread. Her pupils contracted instantly into tiny pinpricks under the harsh, buzzing overhead fluorescence. Saliva vanished from her mouth, leaving her tongue clicking dryly against the roof of her palate. When she finally managed to swallow, the audible pop of her throat muscles resonated in the cramped space. Nobody in the room mentioned her husband's bloated corpse or the bayou. Miller leaned forward, resting his forearms on the metal edge, and simply asked why an identical batch of industrial rope, matching the bindings currently cutting into Arthur's dead wrists, rested so comfortably next to her washing machine. Financial records and cellular logs had already painted a highly damning portrait long before this sit-down occurred. Investigators digging into Arthur's background discovered a marriage decaying quietly behind locked doors. Separate bank accounts highlighted aggressive, unexplained cash withdrawals spanning several months. Burner phone pings mapped a geometric web of deceit pointing directly to the property next door. Thomas Reed wasn't just a casual neighbor borrowing garden tools. The man acted as a permanent fixture in their lives, mowing their grass and drinking their imported beer. He shared bloodlines as a distant cousin of the victim, making his constant presence unremarkable to the neighborhood. Late-night text transcripts, however, exposed graphic, intensely possessive exchanges transmitted between the lovers, while Arthur worked grueling factory double shifts to pay the mortgage. Claiming she desperately needed a lawyer, the widow bolted upright from the interrogation chair. Heat waves distorted the blacktop of the precinct parking lot as she practically sprinted toward her sedan, abandoning any pretense of composure. Fumbling blindly inside her designer leather purse, her manicured fingers shook violently enough to rattle her metal keychain aggressively against the car door. Once secured inside the baking interior, she refused to turn the ignition. Instead, a secondary, prepaid mobile device emerged from the cluttered bottom of her bag. Detectives watching through the second-story blinds noted the frantic, hyperventilating rhythm of her chest heaving against the steering wheel. Pressing the plastic screen flat to her ear, she spoke in rapid, hushed bursts, her knuckles turning bone white from her death grip on the console. The invisible, crushing weight of the trap had finally snapped shut. Exactly 48 hours ticked by before emergency sirens wailed down the quiet suburban street, tearing through the neighborhood. Heavy medical boots kicked open the unlocked front door of the Vance residence, tracking mud across the entryway rug. Paramedics rushed the master bathroom, locating Evelyn convulsing violently against the base of the porcelain toilet bowl. Frothy, neon blue bile stained the pristine white tiles, smelling sharply of commercial rodenticide layered over bitter stomach acid. Her bare fingernails had scraped frantic, bloody crescent moons deep into the linoleum floorboards during the agonizing muscle spasms. An empty, crushed cardboard box of lethal rat bait lay discarded near the clawfoot bathtub, its toxic warning labels smeared with saliva. This scene lacked the tragic, romantic dignity of a devastated spouse drowning in insurmountable grief. It was an ugly, visceral panic. Charcoal pumps and a brutal gastric lavage at the county hospital ultimately dragged her back from the edge of the abyss. Medical staff managed to neutralize the internal toxins, leaving the patient restrained to a metal gurney with thick IV tubes protruding from her bruised forearms. Surviving the fatal dose sealed her legal fate. In the eyes of law enforcement, swallowing strychnine-laced pellets wasn't a desperate act of mourning for a lost husband. It functioned as an undeniable chemical signature of raw, suffocating guilt. Evading justice through a quick trip to the morgue had officially failed. Now, investigators possessed the undeniable leverage they needed to squeeze a confession, and their crosshairs shifted directly onto the man she called from that sweltering parking lot. What part did Thomas Reed play in the dark waters of Blackwood Bayou? Gritty limestone dust coated the back of Thomas Reed's throat. Unmarked Crown Victorias fishtailed onto his dying front lawn, tires tearing deep trenches into the sun-baked crabgrass. He didn't wait for a badge to flash. The suspect dropped a half-smoked Marlboro on the driveway and bolted. Heavy tactical boots pounded the asphalt in aggressive pursuit. Oxygen burned fiercely in the fleeing man's lungs. He made it exactly 40 yards before a patrolman's shoulder caught him directly in the lumbar spine. Brutal impact drove the wind out of his chest, with a wet, hollow crack against the curb. Handcuffs clicked shut over the struggling man's skin. Stainless steel bit sharply into his wrists, creating red indentations that mirrored the exact placement of the nylon bindings he had utilized just days prior. Magnetic tape hissed rhythmically inside the tabletop recorder. Interrogation Room 4 smelled of stale coffee grounds, oxidized sweat, and institutional floor wax. Detectives allowed the absolute silence to stretch, letting the ticking wall clock systematically dismantle the prisoner's remaining nerve. Thomas slouched low in the bolted chair. Mud from his failed escape still clung to his damp forehead. He stared at his own trembling hands, fingers rubbing together incessantly as if trying to shed invisible grime. There existed no grand romantic defense in this space. Investigators saw none of the passionate defiance usually associated with lethal love triangles. Before them sat just a cornered predator realizing the enclosure had been locked from the outside. Miller slid an 8x10 glossy photograph across the scuffed metal table. It depicted the swollen, concrete-anchored bundle hauled from Blackwood Bayou. Saliva caught hard in the younger man's throat. His gaze locked onto the crime scene imagery, and the psychological dam finally broke. Sentences spilled from his lips in fractured, rapid-fire bursts. He outlined a trap utterly devoid of passion, constructed entirely upon cold, calculated mechanics. Evelyn handled the initiation phase. She emptied an entire prescription bottle of liquid sleeping medication into a frosted glass pitcher of ice water, leaving the condensation-covered jug sitting prominently on the kitchen island. Arthur Vance walked through his front door at exactly 6:15 that evening. Factory grease stained the collar of his uniform. Deep exhaustion radiated from the worker's aching joints. Seeking relief from the Louisiana heat, the husband poured a tall glass, drank deeply, and unknowingly severed his own lifeline. Chemical sedatives processed through the blue-collar worker's bloodstream within minutes. Invisible weights seemed to drag his eyelids downward. Arthur collapsed face first onto the master bedroom mattress, lacking the energy to even unlace his heavy work boots. Outside in the humid darkness, a shadow lingered near the azalea bushes. A single text message vibrated in Thomas's pocket, delivering the all-clear signal. He gripped the brass knob on the unlocked patio door. Well-oiled hinges swung inward, without a single betraying squeak. Stepping over the threshold, the intruder carried 30 feet of military-grade synthetic cord wrapped tightly around his knuckles. Stockinged feet made zero sound against the hallway carpet. Thomas entered the sleeping quarters, holding the coiled green rope, his pulse hammering heavily against his eardrums. The premeditated script dictated a quiet, seamless execution, while the target remained completely sedated. Slip the makeshift noose, pull the knots tight, transport the discarded weight to the river. Except, covert pharmacology rarely functions as a perfect science. Dosages miscalculate based on body mass. Human tolerance varies drastically. What the murderous duo expected was a silent, peaceful transfer from deep sleep into eternal darkness. They critically failed to account for a dying man's primal, chemical instinct to survive. Just as the abrasive nylon fibre grazed the warm skin of Arthur's throat, the heavy sedative abruptly lost its grip. The victim's eyes snapped violently wide open. Adrenaline is a chemical failsafe capable of overriding massive pharmacological sedation in milliseconds. Arthur Vance's eyelids snapped open not to the gentle morning sun, but to the suffocating friction of synthetic paracord biting into his trachea. Oxygen vanished. Survival instincts engaged with brutal, panicked efficiency. The heavy-set factory worker thrashed upward against the mattress springs, tearing the green nylon cord inches from his killer's sweaty grip. Thomas Reed stumbled backward, his sneakers slipping on the polished hardwood. Field investigators videotaping the formal reenactment weeks later captured the exact moment the narrative shifted from a silent assassination to a desperate, violent brawl. A dying man fought furiously for his life inside his own sanctuary. Standing by the doorway, the grieving widow hadn't remained a passive spectator. Evelyn dropped her phone on the carpet. Climbing onto the king-sized bed, she straddled her thrashing husband. Hard, angular kneecaps drove directly into Arthur's sternum with enough kinetic force to crack cartilage. She seized his wildly swinging forearms, pinning his wrists flat against the cotton bedsheets, using her entire body weight. Down in the interrogation room, Thomas dryly recounted the wet, guttural rattling escaping the victim's restricted airway. He described the metallic smell of blood pooling in the back of Arthur's throat. While the neighbour yanked the nylon loops relentlessly tighter, Arthur stared directly upward. Above him wasn't a faceless home invader. His failing, bloodshot eyes locked onto the expressionless face of the woman he had promised to love until death. Muscle spasms eventually ceased entirely. Silence reclaimed the suburban master bedroom, broken only by the synchronized, heavy breathing of two murderers standing over a cooling corpse. Rigor mortis wouldn't set in for hours, making the limbs pliable enough to fold into an olive-drab surplus hammock. Hauling the dead weight out the back door left zero blood trails, only compressed grass leading to a rusted aluminum skiff waiting by the muddy embankment. An outboard motor chewed through the black water for exactly 2 miles. Crickets chirped steadily from the reeds. Twin bags of commercial quickreat were secured tightly to the lifeless ankles. Tipping the payload over the gunwale required both of their combined strength. The swamp swallowed Arthur Vance with a heavy, muted splash, instantly smoothing over the disturbance, as if the blue-collar worker had never existed. Justice inside a Louisiana courtroom operates with cold, clinical precision. Gavel strikes echoed like gunshots against the mahogany paneling. The jury required less than 4 hours to dismantle the pair's fabricated alibis and evaluate the forensic geometry of the paracord bindings. Thomas Reed received the absolute maximum penalty. State executioners will eventually strap him to a gurney and deliver lethal chemicals directly into his veins. Evelyn escaped the needle by the thinnest margin imaginable. Because a young child remained in her custody at the time of the arrest, the judge handed down a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. She will draw her final breath, surrounded by razor wire and reinforced concrete. Prison cells offer decades of uninterrupted quiet to reflect on past decisions. Institutional fluorescent lights turn off at exactly 10 o'clock every night. When total darkness floods her 6x9 cage, the widow doesn't see the murky depths of Blackwood Bayou or the rusted skiff. Sleep brings back the master bedroom. It resurrects the exact moment the sedative failed. The ultimate horror of this case isn't found at the bottom of a river. That nightmare lives in the agonizing realization of a loyal husband pinned to his own mattress, watching the mother of his child hold his arms down so another man could steal his final breath. We just watched a river cough up a man murdered for his own bed. Now we move to higher ground, where the soil is too packed to bury a secret quickly. Sometimes, the person holding the shovel sleeps right next to you. A dual sport Yamaha fought the severe incline of Black Mountain Ridge. Mud spun from the aggressive rear tread, spitting violently against the fog. High beams caught a figure standing dead center on the isolated logging trail. Leon Vance squeezed the handbrake. Rubber slid sideways on wet Kentucky clay. A length of heavy, squared lumber swung out from the darkness. Wood collided with the rider's face. The impact crushed his right cheekbone instantly. The bike tipped over, trapping his left calf against the loose gravel. Another strike followed. Fractures radiated across the temporal lobe, pressing sharp bone fragments deep into the soft, grey matter beneath. Blood, mixed with clear cerebrospinal fluid, pooling heavily in the dirt. Leon dragged his fingernails through the slush, choking on the raw copper flooding his throat. His jaw unhinged, struggling to pull oxygen past shattered incisors. The figure above him simply waited, listening to the irregular, wet rattles of a rapidly failing respiratory system. Dawn remained hours away at 4:30 in the morning. Silence reclaimed the switchbacks, interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of a hot exhaust pipe cooling in the mist. 34-year-old timber contractor Leon Vance lay 100 feet from his idling machine. His central nervous system misfired. Motor functions seized and released in spastic waves. He would survive the initial ambulance transport to the county trauma center, only to expire quietly 16 hours later on a surgical table. State troopers approach mountain wrecks anticipating a specific kind of chaos. High-velocity deceleration scatters twisted fiberglass, shreds denim, and snaps tree branches. An officer swept his flashlight beam across the red clay, hunting for a friction trail. He found zero evidence of a slide. The physics of the scene refused to align. 30 yards away from the twitching victim, the beam snagged on an impossible sight. Leon's heavy leather work boots had been completely unlaced. Whoever controlled the ridge had manually removed the footwear from the dying man. Those boots now sat side by side in the mud. The toes pointed perfectly forward, aligned straight down the mountain drop-off. A DOT-approved protective helmet rested gently balanced on the right steel toe. Neither object bore a single scratch from asphalt friction. The arrangement mirrored a pristine retail display, meticulously constructed right next to a fatal, blunt force trauma site. Kneeling beside the convulsing logger, the trooper pulled back the stiff, soaked collar of his jacket. A brass zipper secured a hidden interior pocket. Inside rested exactly $2,000 in crisp $100 bills. Desperate highway robberies conclude with emptied wallets and frantic retreats into the brush. This predator bypassed a small fortune. Someone hiked up a freezing Appalachian goat path, pulverized a man's skull, and then lingered in the dark. The killer took the agonizingly slow minutes required to undress the victim's feet and build a neat, symmetrical shrine in the mud. Why stage footwear while the owner suffocates on his own hemorrhage? Furthermore, how did an ambush artist know the exact minute a connected, wealthy landowner would crawl up this specific, isolated trail in the absolute pitch black? Liquid dental stone poured slowly from a gallon jug, filling a deep, tread-pattern depression gouged into the Kentucky clay. Crime scene technicians worked in complete silence beneath the harsh glare of portable halogen rigs. Wet, sucking noises echoed off the ridge every time a rubber boot pulled free from the muck. The dirt here told a highly specific, mathematical story. Standard roadway fatalities leave chaotic friction scars. Metal scrapes violently across asphalt, synthetic rubber burns into bedrock, and raw panic paints a frantic, sliding trajectory. This particular section of Black Mountain Ridge presented absolute, undisturbed terrain. No frantic braking occurred. Leon Vance never even saw the wooden bludgeon swinging toward his face. Topography dictated the precise location of the execution. Grade elevation on this specific switchback exceeds a grueling 15%. Climbing that severe vertical pitch requires a rider to drop a 400-pound dual sport motorcycle down into first gear. The Yamaha's engine whines, RPMs spike drastically, and forward momentum bleeds out to a miserable, vulnerable crawl. Whoever held the lumber understood localized physics perfectly. They weaponized the mountain itself against the victim. The contractor couldn't swerve to evade the blow. He lacked the speed to accelerate past the ambush point. Gravity transformed a wealthy, experienced outdoorsman into a stationary, helpless target. 30 feet away from the blood-stained impact zone, the dense tree line shifted. Appalachian briars usually form an impenetrable, razor-sharp wall of vegetation. Troopers sweeping the perimeter with heavy flashlights noticed snapped blackberry vines. Flattened ferns formed a distinct, bowl-shaped depression hidden deep within the foliage. A predator had carved out a blind. Broken twigs cracked loudly beneath the investigators' soles as they stepped into the hollowed-out brush. Mud caked the knees of their uniform trousers. Inside this makeshift pocket of wilderness, the geometry of the hunt became sickeningly clear. Line of sight, from the crushed leaves, pointed directly at the kill zone. Kneeling inside the flattened vegetation, a seasoned detective caught an unnatural scent. The damp rot of decaying pine needles masked it initially. Then, an acrid, synthetic chemical odor stung the delicate tissue inside his nasal cavity. It smelled strongly of sulfur and burnt pyrethrum. Resting delicately on a flat piece of slate, sheltered from the mountain mist, was a tiny mound of grey ash. The distinct, spiral remnants of a commercial mosquito coil sat crumbling in the morning humidity. That fragile grey spiral systematically dismantled any working theory of a sudden, impulsive robbery gone wrong. Passionate rage strikes quickly, driven by blind adrenaline and escalating volume. This scene represented the absolute antithesis of a heated argument. The killer hiked up into the unforgiving wilderness hours before dawn. They sat in the freezing, pitch-black woods, entirely surrounded by swarming gnats and biting insects. Striking a match, the assassin ignited a toxic repellent coil, simply to remain comfortable while waiting to fracture a human skull. Patience like that requires a sickening, clinical detachment. It reduces murder to a mundane chore, akin to waiting in a hunting stand for a buck to wander past the crosshairs. Loggers work notoriously unpredictable hours. Leon's daily schedule fluctuated wildly based on timber yields, shifting weather patterns, and sudden equipment failures. Yet, the phantom hiding in the brush struck a match and settled in with absolute, terrifying confidence. The ambush artist didn't guess the timing of the ride. Someone handed over the exact itinerary. The coordinates for the slaughter came directly from the inside. A trap this perfect requires an informant. Who holds the power to send a man up a treacherous mountain pass, knowing exactly what waits in the dark? Cardiothoracic monitors emit a continuous, high-pitched monotone when a human heart officially stops beating. Down the sterile corridor of the county trauma center, that flatline shrill echoed off linoleum floors, scrubbed clean with industrial bleach. Family members collapsed into uncomfortable plastic waiting chairs, sobbing uncontrollably into their palms. Sylvia Vance stood perfectly upright near the glowing vending machines. Her husband's cranium had just succumbed to massive internal swelling, yet her lacrimal glands produced absolutely zero moisture. Dry, unblinking pupils tracked the second-hand ticking on the institutional wall clock. She absent-mindedly picked a stray piece of lint off her designer black blouse. Investigators observing from the nursing station noted her resting pulse seemed calmer than the trauma surgeons currently washing Leon's blood down the surgical drain. Grief acts like a heavy chemical solvent, stripping away polite domestic facades. Leon's older brother paced the waiting room, his knuckles bruised white from punching a cinder block wall in sheer frustration. He cornered a detective near the elevator banks, spitting out a fractured story laced with venom. 2 weeks prior, a screaming match had shattered the windows of the Vance household. Leon caught his wife smiling at a glowing screen at 2 a.m. He snatched the device and hurled it onto the driveway asphalt, grinding the glass into powder beneath his heavy work boots. That pulverized smartphone was the first tangible breadcrumb. It pointed law enforcement directly toward a hidden digital landscape entirely detached from her marriage vows. Subpoenaed cellular tower pings mapped out the infidelity with ruthless geographical precision. Sylvia maintained a dedicated burner line, functioning exclusively to communicate with a 24-year-old drifter named Daniel Thorne. He worked seasonal labor contracts, bouncing between Appalachian sawmills and cheap roadside motels. Text transcripts read like a fever dream of obsessive possession, detailing exactly how they planned to spend the timber contractor's life insurance. Routine behavior patterns also shattered under scrutiny. Sylvia traditionally rode shotgun in the company truck alongside her husband during those early morning timber assessments. Yet, on the specific dawn an assassin swung a wooden beam into Leon's face, the widow claimed a sudden migraine required her to stay tucked warmly beneath her Egyptian cotton bedsheets. Digging deeper into the couple's medical history revealed a terrifying, prolonged campaign of attrition. This wasn't a sudden crime of passion. Emergency room records showed Leon arrived violently ill 3 months ago, violently expelling a tainted casserole that tested positive for high concentrations of localized agricultural pesticide. 6 weeks after having his stomach pumped, a stolen pickup truck swerved across the center line of a mountain highway, attempting to ram his heavy-duty rig over a steep ravine. The contractor survived both incidents, through sheer biological luck and brute mechanical force. The lovers realized standard assassination methods kept failing to sever his tether to the living world. Desperation forced the conspiracy into the darkest, most superstitious corners of the Kentucky backcountry. Financial audits flagged a strange, massive cash withdrawal handed over to an off-the-grid Appalachian root doctor. Sylvia paid a self-proclaimed hex worker to bury mason jars filled with rusty coffin nails, sulfur, and Leon's stolen hair clippings deep in graveyard dirt. She wanted folk magic to stop her husband's pulse while he slept. The curse proved entirely useless against a man built like a redwood. Recognizing that supernatural entities wouldn't do the heavy lifting, the paramours accepted they had to physically cave in his skull themselves. If a woman is willing to summon literal demons to murder the man she married, what kind of monstrous trap did she orchestrate to ensure Daniel Thorne wouldn't miss his swing in the fog? Radio static crackles violently through the precinct bullpen, cutting over the distinct scent of damp wool uniforms and burnt coffee. Warrants sit freshly inked on the shift commander's metallic desk. Homicide detectives understand the fragile geometry of a conspiratorial partnership. When two individuals share the burden of crushing a human skull, their loyalty relies entirely on synchronized narratives. Allow them to communicate, and the murderers will forge a titanium alibi. To shatter the alliance, law enforcement must surgically isolate the weaker link before the widow can dictate the script. Sylvia Vance remained under discreet, 24-hour surveillance inside her climate-controlled home. Meanwhile, tactical teams pivoted their crosshairs directly onto the 24-year-old drifter. Survival instinct kicked into overdrive the moment Daniel Thorne noticed the unmarked sedans idling at the edge of his motel parking lot. The drifter bolted out a rear bathroom window. Shattered fiberglass crunched beneath his heavy boots as he sprinted past overflowing commercial dumpsters. Asphalt quickly transitioned into overgrown logging roads. Kentucky wilderness swallows fugitives with terrifying, predatory efficiency. Dense canopies completely block out aerial surveillance helicopters. Razor-sharp briars shred denim and flesh alike. For a transient labourer accustomed to navigating the backcountry, the Appalachian foothills provided a vast, impenetrable fortress of limestone caves and rotting timber. Bloodhounds hit the scent marker off a discarded flannel shirt near a dry creek bed. Deep, rhythmic bays echoed off the granite ridges. Heavily armed state police formed a tightening perimeter, marching shoulder to shoulder through waist-high brush. Sweat stung their corneas. Ticks burrowed deep into exposed necklines. This rugged terrain doesn't allow for high-speed chases. It demands a grueling, methodical crawl. Tracking a desperate man forces search teams to read the environment like Braille. Snapped twigs, displaced moss, and the faint, coppery smell of panicked adrenaline guided the tactical units higher up the severe elevation. Tactical nets collapsed inward just before sundown. Daniel hadn't fled deep into the untamed wilderness toward the state line. Psychological tethers kept him anchored to the absolute epicenter of his obsession. Canines aggressively cornered the fugitive cowering inside a thicket of thorny locust trees. The suspect knelt in the muck, shivering violently despite the oppressive southern humidity. Briars had lacerated his forearms, leaving ribbons of coagulating blood trailing down to his wrists. Zip ties ratcheted tight, biting into his bruised skin with a sharp, plastic zip. Digital mapping coordinates blinked brightly on the commander's tablet. That captured killer sat exactly 500 feet away from Sylvia's manicured back lawn. Investigators didn't load the suspect into an armoured transport van hidden out of sight. They orchestrated a deliberate, psychological theatre. 4 uniformed officers frog-marched the muddy, bleeding lover directly out of the tree line and onto the van's property. Sylvia stood clutching a ceramic mug on her wooden deck, watching the armed procession breach her perimeter. Porcelain shattered against the decking as the cup slipped through her numb, trembling fingers. Daniel locked eyes with the widow. Adrenaline forced his chest to heave erratically. Not a single shout or struggle fought against the nylon restraints. A slow, deeply unsettling smile crept across his dirt-streaked face. Inside the interrogation room downtown, he wouldn't just offer a standard, tearful confession. The prisoner carried an ace of spades buried in his back pocket, a piece of digital evidence so devastating it would ensure they both drowned together. What secret had the drifter collected in the dark? Fluorescent tubes hummed a relentless B minor chord inside interrogation room. A. Detectives rely on the claustrophobia of painted cinder block to crush a suspect's psychological resolve. Sylvia Vance sat rigidly against the bolted metal table, her fingernails systematically peeling the blue polish off her left thumb. A faint, sour odour of stale spearmint gum and nervous perspiration leaked from her designer collar. Across the hallway in room B, Daniel Thorne slouched inside identical steel constraints. Dried Kentucky clay still clung to his jagged cuticles, smelling heavily of crushed ferns, leaked gasoline, and mountain rot. The romantic loyalty that fueled a brutal nighttime assassination was rapidly evaporating under the harsh glare of institutional lighting. Cornered predators possess zero allegiance. When the trap shuts, basic survival mathematics dictate feeding your partner to the wolves. Sylvia broke first. Her throat clicked audibly as she swallowed a dry knot of panic, spinning a frantic, weeping narrative of utter victimization. She painted the 24-year-old drifter as a psychotic stalker, a violent obsessive who acted entirely on his own unhinged impulses. According to the grieving widow, Daniel manufactured the fatal ambush without her consent or knowledge. Detectives merely nodded, taking meticulous handwritten notes while the digital audio reel spun silently on the scratch desk. Exactly 12 minutes later, investigators carried that specific story across the corridor to confront the muscle. Hearing his lover's betrayal didn't trigger an explosive, table-flipping outburst from the labourer. Instead, a hollow, sickeningly calm chuckle vibrated deep inside his chest cavity. He leaned forward, rattling the heavy chain linking his cuffs to the flooring. The suspect offered a very different architectural blueprint of the slaughter. Sylvia didn't just know about the heavy lumber swinging in the fog. She drafted the entire calendar. To dismantle her fragile alibi, Daniel verbally mapped out the digital breadcrumbs hidden in the dark. He detailed a prepaid burner phone buried deep beneath a pile of dirty laundry inside his motel room. At exactly 3:45 that fatal morning, a green text bubble illuminated his cracked screen. Sylvia had typed out Leon's precise departure time from the driveway, down to the exact second. That short, glowing message functioned as the starting gun for the mountain ambush, but cellular texts can be deleted remotely, or explained away by expensive defense attorneys as misunderstood warnings. Law enforcement requires ironclad, undeniable proof to secure a capital murder conviction in front of a southern jury. The muddy drifter understood this strict legal threshold perfectly well. Lowering his voice to a raspy, conspiratorial whisper, he informed the detectives about a stash of microcassette tapes secured in a shoebox under his mattress. Plastic gears whirred loudly as investigators eventually pressed play on the recovered electronic device. Dozens of magnetic strips captured months of clandestine, midnight conversations between the conspirators. The precinct speakers crackled with Sylvia's unmistakable soprano, explicitly discussing agricultural poison dosages, payments for Appalachian hexes, and the optimal weight of a wooden bludgeon. Detectives stared at the young killer through the observation glass in absolute bewilderment. Seasoned assassins routinely incinerate evidence to avoid the execution chamber. Recording your own premeditated homicide violates the most fundamental principles of criminal preservation. An investigator leaned aggressively across the aluminum table, demanding to know why a man would deliberately manufacture the exact instrument of his own legal destruction. Daniel blinked slowly. His pupils dilated to swallow the harsh fluorescent glare. A soft, devastatingly earnest smile pulled at the corners of his bruised mouth. "I loved her," he murmured, the words scraping softly against the cinder block. "I just wanted to listen to her voice when she wasn't around." Gavel strikes inside the county courthouse eventually sealed their respective fates with cold, mechanical finality. Juries lack sympathy for adulterers who weaponize affection to crush a human skull on a freezing, muddy incline. Both defendants received maximum life sentences without the slimmest possibility of parole. Bleak concrete walls and reinforced steel bars will define the absolute perimeter of their natural existence. Sylvia will spend the next 40 years agonizing over the cruel, unavoidable irony of her capture. The Appalachian terrain didn't betray her. The fatal blow wasn't witnessed by a lost hiker or a passing motorist. She was condemned to rot in a 6x9 cage entirely because the monster she hired was too hopelessly, morbidly infatuated to press the stop button.